Hello friends, welcome to Oracle New Feature video series. In this video, we are going to learn about the usage of default and default on null and few enhancements done on top of this starting from 26 AI onwards. I would like to start with this video with a very simple create table example as shown here. Here I am trying to create a very simple table called T_employee with 3 columns: employee number, e-name and project column. As part of the project column, I specified a keyword called default. I'm sure we all know what is the usage of default keyword. That is, whenever if we are not passing any value for this project column, the default value that is on the bench to be considered. And in fact, this default keyword was there from a very earlier versions of Oracle. I would say that this is a very legacy feature. And in fact, this feature was enhanced as part of Oracle 12C version as a default on null. Okay, so there is a slight difference between a default versus default on null. And the same feature was again enhanced as part of 26 AI, saying that default on null for insert only and default on null for insert and update. So as part of this video, I'm just going to show you 4 examples, one for default keyword, one for the usage of default on null keyword, and one for default on null for insert, and the last example to understand default on null for insert and update, so that it is easy for us to distinguish what is the functionality of each keyword and in what scenario we need to use which specific thing. Let us start with demo. Let's start with our first example to understand the usage of default keyword. So here I'm trying to create a table called T_employee1 with 2 columns, e-name and project. For project column, I'm specifying the default keyword. That is, whenever I want to insert a value into this table, and if I'm skipping the value for project column, I want the employee to be associated with bench value. Okay, so let me first create the table. The table is created. Now let us try to insert some sample value. In this example, I'm trying to insert a Ravi for employee name column. I'm not passing any value for project column. Let me try to insert this. The data is inserted. Let us try to insert one more record into this table. Now I'm inserting Kavin for employee name, and for project column, I'm explicitly passing null value. Let me execute the second insert statement. The data is inserted. Let us try to query from the table. Now if you see, for Ravi, we didn't pass any value for project column. That is why the bench, that is the default value, is considered. However, for Kavin, we explicitly passed the null value, so the null value got inserted. So this is the behavior of default keywords usage. That is, whenever we are not passing any value for the column defined as the default keyword, then the default value will be used. Otherwise, if we explicitly pass any value, even if it is a null value, only that null value will be considered. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to update the table by setting project value as null. I'm executing. Now let me requery from the table. As you can see, if we explicitly update the columns with null value, then null value will get updated. Okay, with this, let us try to understand the usage of the second keyword, that is default on null. Okay, so here I am going to do exactly the same step, but instead of default, I'm just going to use default on null keyword. Let me drop this table. I'm creating the table T_employee2. As I told, for project, instead of default column, I'm using the default on null keyword. The table is created. So first I'm inserting Ravi into this table without passing the value for project column. And in the second insert for Kavin, I'm explicitly passing the null value. Now let us query from the table. Now if you see, the behavior of default on null is whether you explicitly omit this column as part of the insert statement or you explicitly insert a null. In both these scenarios, the default value will get considered. So this is the main difference between the default versus default on null, because the default on null will explicitly consider the default value whether we are not passing any value or we are explicitly passing a null value in both these cases, right? Now let me try to update this table T_employee2 with null value for project column. Now if you can see here, we are getting an error saying that we cannot update. So this is another difference between default and default on null class. Okay, with this we'll try to understand our third class, that is default on null for insert. Okay, so here is the thing. So we are going to follow exactly the same step. So let me drop the table t underscore employee 3. Now I am creating t underscore employee 3 by specifying default on null for insert only. So that's the only difference. Okay, let me try to execute the insert statement. The Ravi is inserted. I'm inserting Kavin with project column as null value. So it is inserted. Let me query from the table. As expected, even for the row Ravi as well as for row Kavin where we inserted a null value, the default value is considered. Okay. In fact, the default on null for insert is exactly same as default on null in terms of functionality. The only difference, just for the clarity, this keyword was introduced from 26 onwards. Okay, now let me try to update the table. Here also we will get exactly the same error what we have seen in the default on null class. Okay, so from functionality wise, both default on null as well as default on null for insert only, both are exactly the same. Okay, with this information we'll move to our last example of how to use the default on null for insert and update. Let me create the table t underscore employee 4. So the only difference is instead of default on null for insert only, I'm using default on null for insert and update. So I'm trying to insert the data Ravi without passing any value for project column, and I am trying to insert record for Kavin by explicitly passing null value for the project column. Now let me query from the table. Since we have mentioned default on null for insert, of course, whether we are omitting the column or we are explicitly passing the null value, in both these cases, the default value will get considered. The additional change what we will see due to this update class is when we try to update this table by setting project as null, in this case, we will not get any error the way what we have got in our previous example. Instead, when we try to update it as null, here you will start seeing the difference. Like even if you update it as null, the default value will get updated in case of default on null for insert and update. So here is a quick summary of what we have learned in the demo. To start with, we have seen examples for default on null, default on null for insert only, and default on null for insert and update. As you can see here, this is how we need to use all these 4 keywords. To start with, whenever we are not passing any value for that particular column which is defined as the default, then definitely the default value will be considered. So here is the example. So in this example, I am not inserting any value for the project column. Okay, the second scenario is, what if we explicitly pass a null value for that column which is defined as the default? So in this case, our project column is the default column. So I'm explicitly passing a null value for this project column. So what is the behavior is, when we use the default keyword, the default value will not be used. Instead, the null value will get inserted. However, if you define as a default on null or default on null for insert only, in both these scenarios, the default value what we defined as part of that column will get considered, and the same thing will go for default on null for insert and update. And our last scenario what we have seen is, if we update a null value as part of that update statement, what is the behavior for all these 4 keywords? To start with, the default keyword, right? When we update a null value, the default value will not get used, and in fact, the null value will get updated for the default keyword usage. If we use the default on null or default on null for insert only, in both these scenarios, default value will not be used. In fact, this will throw an error while during the update. However, in the last case, that is default on null for insert and update, even if you update or insert with a null value, or if you're omitting that column as part of insert also, then the default value will get considered. Okay, I hope you would have learned something new. If you have learned something new, please like this video, subscribe and stay tuned for new future video, interview question, SQL practical question and concept videos. And thanks a lot for watching this video.